So good morning and welcome to the New School. I'm Andrew White and I direct the Center for New York City Affairs, which is an institute at the Milano School of International Affairs, Management and Urban Policy. And we do research and policy work on public education and child welfare and child and family services, community development, and a handful of other topics. We're also home to InsideSchools.org. The center is based here at the Graduate School, which is dedicated to experiential learning and to training many of the very best practitioners, social justice practitioners in the city and now the world, now that we've merged with international affairs. Before we get started, I want to thank the center's staff, and particularly Andrea Colomina and Jackie Wayans for doing the legwork for this. A little bit of background, we had hoped to have most of the major mayoral candidates visit us during the semester, the spring semester, to give sort of substantive talks about issues that matter to them. We managed to get Quinn at the beginning of the semester, and now we have Bill de Blasio, I'm happy to say. The others, we couldn't quite work it out, I think largely because they've got such a traveling roadshow as a group going on that they're not doing so many of these individual appearances. So I'm very pleased we were able to get two of them in the door. We did invite all of them, just so you know. The way this will work this morning is straightforward. The public advocate will give remarks about addressing inequities in the city's economic policies and propose some strategies around boosting employment and income for working class New Yorkers. And then after he speaks, he and I will have a short conversation, and then we'll take your questions on the note cards that we handed out or on a piece of paper. So that'll, when I ask you to hand those in, just raise your hand up and somebody from the staff will collect them. I can't promise we'll get to all your questions, but we'll try. So I've been working for a long time on issues of poverty and development in New York City, so since I have the microphone, I'm going to take this advantage to say just a few things to set up the context. New York City weathered the Great Recession a heck of a lot better than many cities in this country. Unemployment last month fell to 8.4%, which is down a full percentage point since last year. The city's added nearly 300,000 jobs since November 2009, which is the month when the losses turned to gains. Yet, nonetheless, 8.4% is no great shakes. And in fact, if you break that down and look at different boroughs, look at different groups of people, particularly if you look at people who don't have higher education degrees, unemployment is far higher than 8.4% for them. So beyond that, even a recovery can't change the fact that poverty rates in New York City have been hovering around 20% for more than 30 years. The fact is the recession didn't even change that a whole lot, and largely that's because of public policy. The number of people receiving food stamps nearly doubled between 2004 and 2012. To more than 1.8 million New Yorkers, which means almost 1/4 of New York is now receiving food stamps. At the same time, there's a 40% leap in the amount of money claimed by city residents from the federal, city, and state earned income tax credit, which means a lot more working people are qualifying for the tax credit because their wages are low. And that credit is important. Food stamps are important. My point there is just that policy mattered in the recession in keeping poverty at least as low as it is and not much higher. So this isn't the old welfare state. Today, welfare is dwarfed in size by food stamps and the EITC, and it's mostly about supports for working people. Mayors have a lot to do with policy decisions about all of these programs and about workforce development and job creation and potentially even minimum wages and benefits. And they have a lot to do with education and with training young people and helping them turn into leaders as well as independent adults. So I'm pleased that this is our topic this morning. We have a distinguished guest with us today to give us some ideas about what might be next for New York City. Bill de Blasio has been New York City's public advocate since 2010. Before that, for 8 years, he was on the city council representing Park Slope and its surrounding neighborhoods in Brooklyn. He was an aggressive and influential chief of the council's Committee on the General Welfare, overseeing many of the city's human service agencies. And now he's candidate for the Democratic nomination in the 2013 race for mayor. Please welcome Public Advocate Bill de Blasio.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you for the work you do here at the center. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Andrew, for a moment there, I thought you were going to give candidates demerits if they didn't show up by the end of the term, so I was very happy that I made it in time. Now, right now, as we're gathered this morning, one New Yorker is rushing past an attended desk in the lobby of a majestic skyscraper, swiping his key card at the turnstile as he makes his way onto the elevator that will take him into an elegant conference room. In that room, he'll consider how to best capitalize on the stock market's recent surge. A few miles away, a single mother is also rushing, holding her two young children by the hands as they hurry down the steps of the subway entrance, slide their MetroCards through the turnstiles, and press onto a packed subway car, en route to a daycare center located 5 stops from home. During the trip, she'll wonder what her family will cut from this month's budget to pay the grocery bill. I've spoken many times of New York becoming a tale of two cities, one that's working quite well for our city's elite, but one that's forgotten millions of everyday New Yorkers. Those who struggle to find good jobs and quality schools, those denied fair and equal treatment under law, those who can't find affordable housing and needed health care, those who don't have access to early childhood and after-school programs that set our children on the right path and keep them there. Today, I want to shine a bright light on where we are as a city, the challenges we face, and what we can do to repair an inequality of opportunity that threatens to unravel the proud promise of New York. Many politicians talk about strengthening our middle class, and no one disputes that a vibrant middle class has made New York City a beacon of opportunity to so many generations. Immigrants like my grandparents who came to America with the hope of chasing their dreams of making life better for their children and grandchildren. But today's reality is different. We must awaken to a hard but unavoidable truth about where we're headed right now. New York's middle class isn't just shrinking. It's in real danger of disappearing altogether. I am here to say that a New York City that continues the economic and educational policies of the last decade cannot and will not be a city of neighborhoods where middle-class families can live, work, and raise their children. Without a dramatic change of direction, an economic policy that combats inequality and rebuilds our middle class, generations to come will see New York as little more than a playground for the rich, a gilded city where the privileged few prosper and millions upon millions of New Yorkers struggle each and every day to keep their heads above water. Today, the headlines tell the story, as so many of our neighbors know firsthand. On Wall Street, life couldn't be better. Just this week, the Dow Jones Industrial Average set a new record, breaking 15,400 for the first time in history. In Midtown, many corporations are reaping record profits. In Times Square, tourism is booming, and more visitors are filling our hotels than ever before. On the Upper East Side sits one of the nation's most expensive private homes, a 12,000 square foot, $125 million penthouse. Private high schools charge tuition that's higher than most private four-year colleges. There are even restaurants that offer diners the option of a $1,000 caviar pizza. And if you want to splurge, for the same price, a golden opulence sundae for dessert. At work, those at the top are doing better than ever, with CEO pay hitting a record high in 2012 at an average annual salary of $9.7 million, 354 times what the average worker makes. For the wealthiest in our city, these truly are the best of times. A recent study reported by The Economist found New York City is home to more than 389,000 millionaires. We have 3 times as many millionaires as Los Angeles, more, in fact, than LA, Chicago, and Houston combined. All told, almost 5% of our city's population can call themselves members of the Millionaires Club. And those lucky few are making their presence known. In 2009, Manhattan was home to 33 condo buildings with units selling for more than $15 million each. Today, that figure is 54, up more than 60%, according to City Realty. Now, let's state the obvious. At the same time, there's another New York. It exists in all 5 of our city's boroughs, from Soundview to the South Shore, from Bayside to Bay Ridge, from Washington Heights to the Lower East Side. It's a city where anxious parents whisper about making that month's rent while their children sleep in the next room, where a single mom prays each night that her daughter gets picked by the local pre-kindergarten lottery in hopes that she gets the early education that could transform her life, where a job seeker walks more than a mile to find an open library with internet access to post his resume, where working parents with no after-school programs to turn to chase away thoughts about where their middle school child might be so they can finish the final hours of their shift, where a black teenager slides off his hoodie on the way home from high school, hoping this will be a day when the police let him pass without incident. That second city isn't a world away from the first. Indeed, as an article in the New Yorker recently reported, you only need to take a ride on the subway to see how closely situated these 2 cities are. Hop on the 2 train at Chambers Street, home to many Wall Street bankers, and head north, 1 stop to 14th Street. The average income at your destination is less than half of what it was where you boarded. Go 5 more stops to 110th Street. An average income is less than 20% of what it was at Chambers Street. 4 more stops to 149th Street in the Bronx. That figure slips to 8%. On a weekday afternoon, that whole trip takes about 27 minutes. Not on an airplane or a time machine, on the 2 train. The struggle isn't limited to pockets of our city. It's all around us. Today, 1 in 5 New Yorkers lives in poverty. When you include those who earn less than 150% of the poverty threshold, that figure soars to 46% of all New Yorkers. Let me say that another way. Nearly half of those who live in our city are at or very near the poverty level. That's not what New York City is supposed to be. It's not who we are. It threatens our status as the greatest city on the earth. And yet the policies of the past have not set us on the path to bridging that gap of income inequality. Through neglect and denial, in fact, many of our city government's policies over the past 12 years have made that divide even more severe. Consider some statistics from the Nonpartisan Fiscal Policy Institute. Between 2000 and 2010, the median income of the city's 8 wealthiest neighborhoods soared 55%, while median income dipped 3% in middle income areas. Despite tax breaks for businesses tripling since 2001, good jobs haven't followed, with our city's unemployment rate almost a point above the national average. And that's the official unemployment rate. Andrew can tell you plenty about the unofficial reality. For those who do find work, the job often doesn't pay the bills. More than 400,000 New Yorkers didn't earn enough at their job to stay above the poverty level. And our homeless population living in shelters has swollen to 50,000 men, women, and children, the highest level of homelessness since the Great Depression. The numbers are sobering. The impact is felt every day. And we cannot consign an entire generation of New Yorkers to living this tale of two cities. The inequality crisis undermines the very foundation of our city's economy. Now, we haven't forgotten our history. We haven't forgotten that a similar divide helped pave the way to the Great Depression 8 decades ago, as well as the Great Recession just a few years ago. We will not abandon our working poor. We refuse to allow the term middle-class New Yorker to become an oxymoron. And it's not simply a moral imperative. History has taught us that no economy and no city can thrive in the long term under such circumstances. We're simply not building New York's middle class. In fact, no less an authority than the Partnership for New York concluded in a recent report that here in New York City, quote, job growth is primarily in high-wage and low-wage categories. The question, what's left for those in the middle? So that leads us to the challenge of the moment, the great test of our time. What will we, as civic-minded activists, elected officials, and community leaders, do about the great income inequality infecting our city? Before we can talk about the specific steps, let's just take a moment to recognize how we got here. Mayor Bloomberg took office when the city was reeling from both 9/11 and an economic recession. Now, the city's growth strategy up until then had largely focused on keeping the jobs created by our financial sector here in New York, even as technology was making such a strategy next to impossible. The Bloomberg administration, to its credit, saw the need to replace a changing financial sector with something else. The mayor knew that without those elite earners in our system, our tax base would suffer irreparably. So he worked to make the city more attractive to the tech industry, helped spur creative class entrepreneurship, launched a handful of initiatives to foster new industries, most notably the Cornell Technion Graduate School of Applied Sciences. He sought to attract new college-educated workers to our city from every corner of our country and from overseas. And as a result, we've begun to grow our tech economy, and we now have pockets of advanced manufacturing like the Brooklyn Navy Yard to begin to replace the tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs we've lost in the previous decade. That was a good thing for New York, and we can and we must continue this effort. But here's the problem. If all we do as a city is to replace one elite economy with another, we will fail millions of New Yorkers who need good jobs that work for their lives. New Yorkers who graduate from our public schools and city colleges, who live in all 5 boroughs, who aren't coveting a slot on the fast track so much as crying out for a job that lets them live a stable middle-class life in the city they love. Look at the facts. The tech industry and creative class can be gold mines for high-paying jobs for those lucky enough to land one. But employment growth in other emerging industries, retail, tourism, and service jobs, is marked by low-wage jobs that give New Yorkers little or no ability to move into the middle class. And it's in creating an economy focused on jobs for the working and middle class where Mayor Bloomberg has simply failed to act. It is in this New York where the inequality crisis is most desperate, made worse through policies generated by those who either don't see, won't acknowledge, or just can't understand how millions of New Yorkers really live. Take our neighborhood businesses, for starters. Under this administration, New York's small businesses, particularly those in the outer boroughs, have been, at best, ignored. At worst, they've been under siege. While bankers and developers and hotel owners have prospered, mom and pop shops have been targeted by a ticketing war that is incredibly complex and extremely expensive, often in the name of filling the city's budget holes rather than protecting consumers. We've got to free our small businesses from that burden by replacing a ticketing blitz, which unfairly penalizes hardworking shop owners, with common sense enforcement. Instead of taking money away from small businesses that can't afford it, we must refocus tax subsidies away from those who don't need them and strategically invest in jobs that lift all New Yorkers. That begins by ending corporate giveaways and reinvesting those resources into foundations for broad-based growth. Today, I'm proposing wholesale reform of our city's tax incentive policies that give hundreds of millions of dollars to office towers on Park Avenue and unaccountable one-shot subsidies to companies who can do without them. The Fresh Direct deal, giving away $130 million in taxpayer money to support low-wage jobs, all in response to the company's empty threats. That was a mistake. And it's a symbol of how upside down our economic policies have been. By reforming New York's incentive programs, we will free up resources to support entire industries and small businesses in all 5 boroughs and begin to reinvest in real pathways to economic opportunity, like our sorely underfunded CUNY system. So instead of $130 million for Fresh Direct, we'll give our university system a fresh start, rebuilding what was once a gateway to opportunity for generations of New Yorkers. In lieu of big giveaways to a few specific companies, we will pursue a city economic strategy that puts a premium on growing whole sectors of small businesses in emerging industries. From green jobs to food exports to advanced manufacturing, companies that can generate good jobs at decent wages in all 5 boroughs. This administration made some strides in spurring development in the outer borough neighborhoods closest to Manhattan. But to truly prosper, we must focus on economic development hubs that push deeper and deeper into the outer boroughs, into all our neighborhoods. Doing business in New York is tough, and the fact is City Hall doesn't make it any easier. And that's why I'm also proposing an expanded revolving loan fund for startups of $100 million from incentive subsidy reform, and a new NYC Innovation Equity Fund for entrepreneurs. Let's put boots on the ground to work with local businesses and immigrant entrepreneurs to coordinate local job creation efforts and help small businesses flourish. And while efforts to make New York a global hub for young talent are admirable, we cannot afford to import more college-educated New Yorkers than we produce. We must create jobs for young people who are growing up in this city, who have always called this home. To get there, I have 4 concrete solutions. First, let's adopt Scott Stringer's proposal for a dedicated STEM program at CUNY and start preparing more graduates of our public high schools for jobs in the city's tech industry, and set a goal that within 8 years, the majority of skilled technology-related jobs in New York City will be filled by those educated in New York City schools. Second, in the fast-growing health sector, let's prepare more of our young people and unemployed for middle-skilled, middle-class jobs by scaling up innovative programs like the Bronx's Health Education and Research Occupations High School that connects students to CUNY and work experience at Montefiore Hospital. And let's train New Yorkers for the 16,000 registered nursing jobs that are currently being filled by temporary foreign guest workers due to a shortage of qualified applicants here in our city. Think about that for a moment. The 2 fastest growing sectors of New York City's economy are dominated by workers who aren't from New York. Third, for people without a college degree, Let's replace the hodgepodge of overlapping and ineffective job training programs and invest in industry-linked apprenticeship programs directly connected to jobs in new fields like green building technology, information technology, and telecommunications. And fourth, let's connect every city high school to a relevant college, apprenticeship program, or business hub from day one. There should be no exceptions. Every high school able to connect its students to the next step in their lives. Let's do all of these things so we can stop importing engineers and nurses and other skilled workers and start insourcing good jobs for workers who live here. But even while we connect more New Yorkers to the skilled economy of tomorrow, we need to help lift up those who need good jobs today. That's why today I'm calling on New York City to increase the number of contracts going to minority and women-owned businesses which are far more likely to be located in our lowest income communities, creating jobs for those who desperately need them. And let's expand opportunity for low-income New Yorkers to gain entry into the building trades by requiring public construction projects funded by New York City to train and hire public housing residents and residents of our low-income communities. Finally, we must recognize that the best economic development policy is a living wage job with good benefits that allows people in our neighborhoods to spend and invest in their own community. A core component of our economic development policy must be to raise the floor for all workers with, one, a broad living wage bill for workers in medium and large-sized commercial businesses that receive public funds. Two, a crackdown on wage theft and labor law abuses. And three, an affordable housing policy that requires developers to do more for middle-class and low-income New Yorkers when their property is rezoned, not giveaways like a $1 billion tax break to industry titans that have been proposed. And to ensure that our workforce has the security they need to be as productive as possible, let's invest in child care and after-school programs that give working parents the security of knowing their children are safe and out of harm's way while mom or dad are on the job. But fixing our economic focus is just one piece of the puzzle. At the very same time, we need to turn the page on the current era in our public schools, a period when changes often made our challenges greater, with policies that closed or relocated schools in our most struggling neighborhoods, installed a schools chancellor who never served as an educator, turned classrooms into places where educators are forced to teach to the test, and either barely added to or else scaled back funding for early childhood education and after-school programs. A quality local school in every New York neighborhood shouldn't be a privilege, it should be a right. That's why I've said what others will not, to guarantee every child gets access to a quality pre-K program and every middle school child has safe after-school activities. We're going to ask the wealthiest in our city to pay a little more. My plan does just that and pays for it by assessing a modest surcharge on those earning more than $500,000 a year. Now, some have taken issue with that approach, arguing that raising taxes on the wealthy is a non-starter. I say that leaving any child of New York City behind is a non-starter and will only make the economic inequality we face today grow worse. Now, I know that addressing the inequality crisis is a massive challenge, and we won't solve it overnight. But I also know this: real leadership means being unafraid to say what needs to be said, even when it's not politically popular. As a great New Yorker, Franklin Roosevelt once said, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little." That test must remain our test today, and let us step forward to meet it. Because whether the issue is public safety or taxes or job creation or educational opportunity, New York City has been made great by leaders who saw that we are truly a city of neighborhoods, leaders who know that all 5 boroughs were created equal and should be treated that way. Leaders who take their cues not from Wall Street or big developers, but from everyday New Yorkers struggling to make it. We don't have to continue to live the tale of 2 cities that confronts us today. There is a better way, and it's within our reach. But to close that divide, to unite our city, to guarantee that New York is once again a city of opportunity for every resident, in every borough, from every walk of life, we need fearless, unflinching vision, political will, and an ironclad commitment to change the path we're on. That is a foundation for greatness, and it must be our collective cause, the most urgent priority of our time. If we rise to that challenge, we will restore the promise of New York for our lives and for future generations who will thrive in the city we love so much. Thank you.
You have to hold the mics.
Hold them up?
Yeah.
All right.
If I can get it off here.
We can do this.
All right.
Teamwork.
So, all right. Inspiring talk. I guess my first question is the big picture one. It's been 12 years since a candidate has run on the sort of dual city idea of you know, the extraordinarily rich on the one hand, the rest of us on the other. It didn't work so well for Fernando Ferrer in 2001. Why now?
I think for a long time people have believed that there's growing inequality. And I think if you think back to 2001, it was already evident, but it's been a sea change since then. Mm-hmm. It's so much deeper. So I believe there's always been a sense of fairness running through the people of the city and a fear that we were starting to lose that opportunity for all that sort of characterized New York. I always say this is our values, this is our experience, you know. My grandparents got here almost 100 years ago and came to this city from southern Italy knowing there would be opportunity. It was a given. There were language barriers, but they knew they could overcome them. And I think until recently there was an assumption that one way or another there was a pathway of opportunity. And only in recent years has that begun to fray so deeply that people now worry consistently across neighborhoods about whether they'll even be able to live in their own neighborhoods anymore. Mm-hmm. So it is that problem even was beginning to be in evidence in 2001, but it got so much worse with the economic crisis the last 5 years. It got so much worse with some of the city's policies. And by the way, the mayor's been unabashed about saying he wanted to have a high-end economy. Right. Remember the famous speech when he said, we're like Bloomingdale's, we're the high end of everything, we need luxury housing and Wall Street and tech, and that was his vision. So his vision dug in some trends that were already starting. The recession made it even worse. And now it is commonplace that people assume may not be able to live in their own neighborhood, and it's a huge question mark whether they can find a middle-class job. Mm-hmm. When I talk about that openly in communities all over the city, I find that people respond and appreciate that the reality is being acknowledged, and that the simple phrase I always connect it to, I say, this is not sustainable. The status quo can't continue. I find people get that, mm-hmm. feel it, want that change. So I believe the fact is people are living a tale of two cities. They know it, and they don't want to continue living it.
Right. One of the things you said is that you know, the two fastest growing industries are largely populated now with people coming from out of town to take those jobs. And it's certainly true that the number of people with master's degrees has gone through the roof in New York. It's amazing, actually, if you look at the numbers. But in the healthcare system, it's also true that huge numbers of trained people are coming in. Isn't that, though, sort of a defining part of New York City? People coming from other places. Most of us in this room probably originally came from somewhere else, right? So mightn't somebody hear that and interpret it as sort of a protectionist idea, like you want to keep this economy for the people who live here now?
No, I don't think it's protectionist. I think we need this economy to work for the people who live here now. There's always room for others to join us. There'll always be people moving in and moving out. That's part of New York life as well. But when the economy is failing our own people consistently, fundamentally, we can't stay on the same path. And again, I just ask us to look at history. It's a very recent phenomenon that people could no longer find middle-class jobs, and that became the common reality. Even more sharply on the other side, and you know it well, the affordability crisis, the notion that people couldn't find a place to live in their own neighborhood they could afford. I mean, that's also a function of gentrification and a lot of other trends. But when you add it all up, I think it calls upon us to think differently. For one thing, to really value the notion of having what we do cause sort of a circulation of resources within our own communities. That's why I focus on hiring people from New York City, hiring people from low-income communities, for example, in public construction. That's why I focus on MWBs. You know, I think we've lost track of the fact that when you have this kind of profound economic crisis, when you have this kind of structural imbalance, if you don't take every resource you have and apply it inward, you will only deepen the crisis. So I think it's untenable to have a city where people grow up here and then know they're forced to leave at a certain point. That's not acceptable. I think we have to solve that problem. There will still be plenty of opportunities for people coming in from outside at the same time.
Getting into some of the specifics of what you talked about, on the one hand, you've proposed pulling back corporate incentives, particularly the commercial, industrial and commercial incentives that cost the city something like $600, $700 million some years. On the other hand, you're looking to require that city contracts include set-asides for low-income residents and more aggressive workforce development rules and possibly living wage rules. How do you get, as mayor, the business community on your side to accept this?
I think it's fair to say that, one, as a person, I know how to work productively with the business community. I think in the end, the vast majority of people I know in the business community are looking for a practical way to move forward on any issue. And so part of this is just working, communicating, finding some common ground. But I think the bigger picture is this. The business community is doing very well in this city. Very, very well. There's plenty of profit to be made. And this is why my affordable housing plan keys in on mandatory inclusionary zoning and simply says, if you want to develop, you want to do any major development in this city, the price of admission is creating affordable housing. And some people say to me, well, what if a developer says no to that? Well, my answer is simple. The next developer will say yes to that. Because look at the values in this city today. Look at the opportunity. If you have a prime piece of land to be developed, and you're a developer trying to make a decision, you're not going to pass that up lightly, knowing your competitor would happily take the deal. So I think it is, in a sense, speaking the language of business back to business. This is what we need for our people. In exchange, there will be plenty of great opportunities for the business community to profit, but this is what we need for our people.
Right. In talking about affordable housing, you mentioned the homeless shelters. Would you go back to a system of city-funded rent subsidy? And what might that look like in a way that would be affordable and would work?
You know, I've, for years, as chairman of the General Welfare Committee, fought for preventative programs to stop homelessness. And it was heresy to the Bloomberg administration for the first 4 years, their first full term. And then they suddenly adopted it, and it wasn't heresy anymore. Right. And I have noticed there's that interesting tendency. You remember for 7 years, the mayor said anyone who wanted to change term limits was disgusting. And then in the 8th year, it was no longer disgusting. So I fought for homelessness prevention programs. They were finally implemented. Now, you can debate each and every specific of each approach, but I think in the main, we were getting somewhere with homelessness prevention. Rental subsidies and anti-eviction legal services. I always say they are so much more humane. The first reason to like these approaches is they keep families in their apartments, in their neighborhoods. They keep children in their local school. They don't cause the horrendous disruption that going into shelter causes. And this is, and it didn't used to be in our mind or even in reality as much a problem for children. Now we've got over 20,000 kids in shelter. So we are damning the next generation with a policy that actually allows people lightly to go into shelter rather than tries every tool we have to stop it. Bloomberg administration adopted those policies and then moved away again a few years ago. I would reinstate them. I always use the example, a family in shelter is almost a cost of $4,000 a month. For that same family, a $1,000 a month rental subsidy could keep them in their apartment. So from a taxpayer point of view, it's a no-brainer. From a humanity point of view, even more clear. In the short term, to get that number down, we're going to have to use some of the other tools we have. We're going to have to set aside some Section 8 vouchers, some public housing units to get that number down. We can't live with 50,000 people in shelter. But in the long run, I think the preventative programs will really help us.
Okay, we're going to take questions on your note cards in a minute or two. So if you hold them up like this and then pass them down, somebody will come around and collect them and bring them up here. It's not working. All right. We'll just pass it back. Oh, no. Okay. Oh, nobody wants to hear me anyway. So.
No, we value you,
Yeah,
Andrew.
there you go.
We do.
All right. So your plan today describes some important investments in career and technical high schools and in CUNY, and even pinpoints the source of money for this through the reduction of corporate incentives. In other speeches you've spoken about, and here at the end you spoke about high-quality preschool and after-school programs. These changes in taxes that would pay for this, that you've talked about on the stump repeatedly, have to be approved by Albany, right? How do you go about, as a new mayor, if you get elected, how do you go about convincing not just the state assembly, but the Senate to go along with that and the governor?
I relish this question.
Okay.
First, let me make clear, I also relish actually saying how I'm going to pay for things. So today, talking about reductions in corporate subsidies, giveaways, unproductive subsidies, I think we could gain as much as $250 million a year through that. And again, the focus of that money then would be to reinforce CUNY and to help build our small business sector, which is still ultimately one of our biggest job growth engines. On the early childhood and after school point, again, you got folks talking about all sorts of wonderful things for our city. I'm talking about how to pay for it. It is $530 million a year. It comes from a tax on those who make $500,000 or more. It would be a change in the tax rate for that income bracket from 3.9% to 4.3% for 5 years. That is how we could actually fundamentally change education in the city. A guaranteed pre-K seat, full day for every child, a guaranteed after-school seat, 3 more hours a day for every middle school child who needs it and wants it. Okay, how do you get by Albany? Well, here's what I'd submit to our friends in the state Senate. We are trying to help struggling children. We are trying to bridge an educational disparity gap. We are trying to build the workforce of the future. We are trying to help struggling parents in a city that's very hard to be a parent in. We are asking for a small sacrifice from those who are doing well, in fact, lower than the tax rate 10 years ago in this city for the same income bracket. Bloomberg actually raised up the personal income tax level for that income bracket after 9/11 for a period of time. My question to any state senator who doesn't believe in that is, are you ready to vote against our children? Are you ready to vote against the future of our workforce and our economy? Are you ready to vote against closing disparities in our society? If they want to say yes, I will happily take that to their constituents. And I think that's part one of the answer. The second part is very quick. The history on Albany and city taxation is when a mayor of New York City requests the right to tax ourselves, it is almost always granted.
All right. This is a question from the audience on a similar theme, if I can read this. Fiscal analysts from all points in the political spectrum speak of a looming, perhaps $7.8 billion fiscal cliff in New York City's budget. Many of your proposals will cost money. Do you believe that tax increases on the wealthiest 10% of New Yorkers and redeployment of wasteful economic development subsidies will cover those costs? If not, what other measures do you propose?
So I think what I'm trying to say is we have to take strategic actions quickly to address this crisis. The short-term ones like reprogramming the subsidy money to where it could actually help build our economy and create middle-class jobs, that's CUNY, that's small business. That's also 5 borough in a way a lot of the Bloomberg economic policies are not. I'm saying here's how you pay for it. You stop putting taxpayer money into less productive things. Giveaways or subsidies that don't actually help you address income disparity. On early child and after school, obviously a specific funding stream to pay for that. Now, here's the bigger crisis you refer to. Like everything, you said people across the spectrum have commented. People across the spectrum, everyone has a different number on what this crisis in terms of the labor contracts will mean. The one thing we all know for sure is no mayor in the history of New York City before Michael Bloomberg ever had the gall or the irresponsibility to leave every single labor contract open simultaneously. This is, you want disgusting? This is disgusting. And I hope when people look at the whole of the Bloomberg experience, and I've said today some of the things I think are admirable and should be continued, but I hope this gets weighed fully. This was not fair to future generations to spend years failing to address open contracts. Now, the fact is, to solve that problem is going to take very complex, very private negotiations, union by union, to figure out what we can do in the short term, what we can do in the long term, to recognize the limits on what we can do. And I always say the best example is the 1970s, which was worse than this. I mean, I'm very troubled by what we have now, but I remember that fiscal crisis. It was worse. And key city unions got together and worked with the mayor to fashion a long-term solution. And we're going to have to do something like that again. That would not stop me from making these strategic moves. They're two separate realities. If we don't make the strategic moves, we can't, one, build our economy, but two, address income disparity, which if we don't address it, it will pull us down. It's as simple as that. So that has to stay on track no matter what. That has to be a single-minded pursuit. The fiscal crisis is going to be dealt with in a series of fine and subtle moves over years to get us through it. Could be 2 years, 3 years, could be more. Obviously very much wrapped up in what the larger economy does. But I won't move away from the strategic pieces because we need them.
Right. This is an interesting question. And it gets to the question of labor, I think more generally. Should police, firefighters, and teachers live in New York City to get and hold their jobs?
It's not realistic. It's a very noble goal. It's just not realistic. I think we can do some things. When I was at HUD in the Clinton administration working for then Secretary Cuomo, we had some good programs that helped make, for example, foreclosed properties available to law enforcement officers at reduced rates to encourage them to live in different communities. I think there's a lot to be said for that. And I think we can innovate some approaches in the city in that vein, but they will only reach a certain number of people. I think the big picture is the affordability crisis has hit law enforcement personnel particularly deeply, because look at the starting salaries of cops and firemen. They can't afford to live in most parts of the city. So in the short term, no, you can't change that fundamental economic reality. In the long term, as we build out, my affordable housing plan calls for 200,000 units over 10 years. I hope some of these other changes start to really balance our economy. It might be something we can get to in the future, but it's not something we can do today.
Right. Along those lines, there's the larger question of labor and its place in our economy. Given that the city is increasingly split between high-wage jobs and low-wage jobs, and not a lot in the middle, seems like an obvious solution to that, or a difficult but an obvious solution, is unionization. Can a mayor be an activist in support of unionization of private sector labor?
Yes, and we need to. This is another example of the changes in our country, in our city, that we have to acknowledge and address differently. Look, it's a known fact that I believe in the concept of the labor movement. I believe in its historic role in our society. The hackneyed phrase you hear, the American labor movement, the people who brought you the middle class. There's a lot of truth in that. And the pressure that's been put on labor movement, the decline of the labor movement, has contributed to that pushing down of wages and benefits. Sort of Walmartization of America has really been directly connected to the constant attacks on labor and some of the decline of labor. I don't think it's the most difficult mathematical equation to say if more people in private sector jobs are part of labor unions, they will have meaningfully better wages, and they will have a crazy wild thing we call benefits, health insurance, pensions, things that will at least, not obviously in every case pension, but things that will give some chance of family stability, economic security. And I always say, this is not just what I believe politically or morally, it's extraordinarily practical. If people in the private sector workforce are in unions and therefore are secure over the longer term, it helps all communities, it helps the city, but also it makes sure the taxpayers are not constantly having to catch people when they fall. Because in the absence of those decent wages and decent benefits, family economies will crumble all the time. And so, as part of regenerating the middle class, we do need to support the growth of private sector labor. It's something I've done as public advocate in the city council. It's something I continue to do. And I think it's absolutely appropriate for a mayor to say to both sides, how can we work out the issue? How can we, how can the good offices of mayor be a mediating tool? But I have no compunction at saying also, if an unfairness is being done, as happened, for example, with the Cablevision workers recently, perfectly appropriate for a mayor to say, that has to be resolved, or I'll make my voice heard on this issue.
In terms of, wow, my mic actually works. In terms
Why
of,
do you have the good mic?
I'll trade.
It really hurts.
So one of our audience asked about workforce security for retirees and family members who have older parents to care for. What services could be put in place to ensure that workers didn't have to choose between elder care and their jobs? MetLife coined the term, quote, caregiver glass ceiling, impacting mostly women due to elder care responsibilities. Does this fit in with your proposals around living wage jobs and so on? Is there something that the city needs to do around that?
Well, there's something the city can do, and there's obviously other changes we have to make, but let's talk about the city perspective. And I want to take you back to, one part of my life was working for the Clintons. And I want to remind people, when the Clinton administration proposed family and medical leave, 1993, if I have my history right, it was considered radical. But it was so important because it was an acknowledgement that public policy has to address the realities of family in an ever-changing world. The structure of family, the reality of family and the economy had changed, decades earlier, and yet government policies were based on a very different kind of family reality. Family medical leave started something. It is clearly picked up here today in New York City on the issue of paid sick days. And I want to use that as a sort of a pathway to the answer. I've been fighting for years for paid sick days in the city. It's something localities can do. It's one of the tools we have for economic fairness and for supporting people to have economic stability. It makes a huge difference in people's lives. The bill that was passed was progress. It simply wasn't enough. I've said, if elected, I would immediately act to cover the over 300,000 people not covered by the recently passed bill, and I'd make it effective immediately, not a year or two from now, because we need that help for people right now. That's an example. If a employee has a little flexibility to deal with family dynamics without losing pay, that's part of how you address that. If we are pushing up, slowly but surely, wages and benefits, that makes the pressure on that caregiver less. One of the things in my affordable housing plan is we're going to focus a certain number of units on seniors, many of whom are being priced out of neighborhoods, and that creates additional tension. So I think it's a series of things we do that relieve some of the pressure. But we also need to keep working on a broadly more fair economy if we want to address it more fundamentally.
Okay. Just a couple more questions. One is, the core of your proposals today are around workforce development strategy. CUNY is a central part of that. Can you elaborate a bit more on what you envision for the role of CUNY? Today, I think the mayor is responsible for about $800 million of CUNY's budget, primarily the community colleges. Do you have ideas about how those community colleges could be reoriented, geared up to provide services, to provide educations that'll move young people right into the economy?
Yeah, I think, what I'm trying to say in the speech is sort of hitting from a different points on the spectrum, linking our high schools to colleges, including obviously CUNY colleges, and to workplaces, supporting CUNY more. We're talking about as much as $150 million more a year under this proposal for CUNY, for tuition assistance to make CUNY available to more folks. And what's happening? A lot of kids who go to CUNY right now is they simply can't finish.
Right.
They start, but they can't finish. We want to create continuity. But I think programmatically, your question gets at curriculum. That's part of why I'm so high on Scott Stringer's proposal. We think we can make short-term changes in parts of the CUNY curriculum, create certificate programs that actually will help young people go from high school to even community college, get the immediate training to qualify them for the tech sector and get right into the tech sector. I honestly don't pretend to be an expert on the tech sector. Mm-hmm. But meeting with folks from the tech sector, I kept hearing repeatedly that they all, I've heard the same exact formulation from people in different meetings, that they appreciate the Applied Science Center very much. Cornell Technion, that's great. But they also know that's years away from really being felt in our local economy. And that's one piece of the puzzle. What a number of folks said to me was, CUNY is where they could get their workforce right now. And in terms of volume, the CUNY schools produce, percentage-wise, a huge number of graduates with computer science training, but not calibrated to the actual jobs that are available now, not made sort of career-oriented. Right. So I think it's a combination of more funding, more tuition assistance within it, but also reorienting elements of the curriculum.
Yeah. You'll have to bring the expertise to CUNY for this work, obviously, to be able to train the students. The other piece of that whole sort of trajectory is the high schools. And there's been a fairly strong focus in the Bloomberg administration on improving career and technical education. I think there's now something like 40 CTE high schools. Do you foresee expanding that, creating new specializations, and larger than that, the question of high school choice and the sort of the concept of thematic small high schools? CTE fits in that, but so do many of the more liberal arts-oriented schools. Is that concept of high school education part of what you see in New York City's future?
Could you ask a broader, more multifaceted question?
No. But let's stick with the CTE piece.
Maybe ask me what is the meaning of life. I could try that too. Okay. About 2 years ago, I think it was, we did a report in my office, in the Public Advocate's office, on career and technical education. For those of us of a certain generation, it used to be called vocational education. That phrase went out of vogue for good reason, because vocational education was often based on tracking and segregation of various kinds. Career and technical education is actually saying we are going to value any young person's pathway. Going to college is great. You can get some career and technical education and still go to college. You can get career and technical education and go right into the workforce. Every pathway is valued. Now, 2008, the Bloomberg administration did a very good commission on career and technical education, came up with a host of, we think, very positive proposals, and then didn't do them. And only in recent times, last year, have they really lurched forward on it. And I think it's good. I think that impulse is good. I think it's very, very late, but it's still good. Yes, I would deepen it. I don't think there should be a high school in this city that doesn't have one of those, or more than one, of those kind of direct linkages. It doesn't really, in my opinion, we don't differentiate between whether a school is more liberal arts focused or more science focused. Well, the point is there needs to be a clear forward path and a clear connection, whether it's to a university, to a business, something that helps the young people at that school see a pathway. I want to emphasize to everyone that in a tighter, tougher economy, it's harder and harder for a lot of young people to visualize where the next steps are, and if they even exist. But I'm a big, big believer in deepening career and technical education, because I think for the very substantial percentage of kids who are not going to go to college, who can't afford it or it's not their choice, there are some real opportunities to go into the workforce directly out of high school if we would update the curriculum to the needs of the current economy, tech, healthcare, information technology, et cetera, and create those linkages. And that linkage with business especially And I believe there's lots of folks in the business sector of the city who would like to, who are very charitable, who would like to be involved with local schools. That means internships, that means mentorship programs, that means bringing the expertise into the school and helping improve the curriculum. I think it deeply clarifies for young people that there is a path forward for them.
Right. You handled that very broad question in a very broad, philosophical, but pointed way. So I think
was that a compliment?
I think so. So I think we're going to wrap it with that. Thank you all for coming, and thank you very much for
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here.
substantive discussion.